My dad slapped me hard across the face on his 60th birthday. "What kind of worthless junk did you give me?" he shouted in front of hundreds of elite guests. I left the country club with tears burning my eyes and ran away into the pouring rain. That same night, a black SUV screeched to a halt beside me on a deserted road. Two men grabbed my arms and pushed me into the back seat. I thought my life was over. But then the interior lights clicked on, and an older man in a tailored suit looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Hello, dear," he said gently. "I am your biological father." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to break your spirit. My name is Nia. I am 28 years old and I work as a corporate restructuring executive here in Atlanta. For my entire life, I thought I was the biological daughter of Desmond and Camille Sterling. Desmond is a prominent real estate mogul in the city. He builds towering skyscrapers, develops sprawling luxury condos, and commands absolute respect from everyone who crosses his path. To the outside world, the Sterlings are the flawless picture of Black excellence and generational wealth. But behind the closed doors of our massive estate in Buckhead, I was never treated like a daughter. I was the family scapegoat, the permanent punching bag, the one who could never measure up to my older sister Jada. Jada was the golden child. She was groomed for high society from birth, given expensive designer clothes, and handed a vice president title at my father's company, right out of college, despite having zero qualifications. I took a different path. I paid my own way through school, studying late into the night to build a difficult career in mergers and acquisitions, completely independent of Desmond's empire. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my worth in the cutthroat business world, Desmond would finally look at me with genuine pride. I wanted his validation more than anything. That desperate delusion died completely on the night of his 60th birthday gala. The grand ballroom at the country club was dripping in crystal chandeliers and shiny gold accents. Hundreds of Atlanta's most influential people were dressed in their finest flowing gowns and tailored tuxedos, sipping expensive vintage champagne and waiting eagerly for the gift presentation. Desmond sat in a high-backed leather chair in the center of the room, playing the role of a king holding court over his loyal subjects. Guests stepped up one by one, handing him expensive watches, keys to rare vintage cars, and boxes of imported cigars. When it was my turn, my hands were shaking. I stepped forward, holding a small, polished wooden box. I had spent my entire savings account acquiring and restoring a beautiful 18th-century naval compass. I knew Desmond loved maritime history and spent hours reading about ancient navigators. I thought it was a thoughtful, meaningful gift that showed I paid attention to his passions. I handed the heavy mahogany box to him. He opened the brass latch, stared down at the compass, and the room went completely silent. I waited for a warm smile. I waited for a simple thank you. Instead, Desmond stood up abruptly, his face twisted with absolute disgust. He grabbed the heavy brass compass and threw it directly at my chest. It hit my collarbone with a loud, painful thud and crashed onto the polished marble floor, the glass dial shattering into dozens of tiny pieces. Before I could even process the shock of the physical impact, Desmond raised his large hand and slapped me hard across my face. The sound cracked through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. A sharp, stinging pain radiated from my cheek down to my jaw. "I build skyscrapers." "Nia," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I command a financial empire. What kind of worthless junk is this? You have always been a cheap, embarrassing stain on this family." I stood there paralyzed by the public humiliation. The room full of wealthy guests stared at me with a sickening mixture of pity and contempt. I looked over at my mother, Camille. She was wearing a stunning emerald green gown, calmly sipping her champagne as if she were watching a television show. I desperately hoped she would intervene, that she would finally act like a mother and defend her child from this abuse. But Camille just looked me up and down with cold, calculating eyes. She walked over her designer heels, stepping right on the shattered pieces of my carefully chosen compass. Go wait in the car, Nia, she whispered harshly, her voice laced with pure venom. You are ruining your sister's engagement announcement. Just get out of my sight. Jada stood just a few feet away, smirking and clinging tightly to the arm of her new fiancé, Preston. Preston was a wealthy, arrogant white man who worked as Desmond's chief financial officer. He had always despised me, constantly making snide remarks about my background and career choices. He looked at me now like I was something foul he had scraped off the bottom of his expensive Italian leather shoes, letting out a soft, mocking laugh that cut through me. The sheer humiliation of the terrible moment was suffocating. I could not catch my breath. I turned around and ran out of the grand ballroom fast. I pushed past the confused valet stand and sprinted out into the dark, pouring rain. I did not wait around. I just kept walking down the wet, empty highway, my hot tears mixing with the freezing rain, unaware that my entire reality was about to be rewritten forever. I pushed against the glass doors of the country club lobby, desperate to escape the suffocating ballroom. Before I could step out into the storm, a sharp laugh echoed behind me. I froze. My older sister Jada strutted toward me, her arm wrapped tightly around her new husband Preston. Preston was a wealthy, arrogant white man who Desmond had worshipped from the moment they met. He was also the chief financial officer of my father's real estate empire. Preston thrived on making me feel inferior. He loved using his Ivy League vocabulary to mask his blatant racism, constantly disguising vile insults as playful family banter. He stepped in front of the glass doors blocking my exit. His tailored tuxedo jacket brushed my arm, and he smelled of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and peeled off a crisp $100 bill. Here, Nia, he said, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. Take $100. Go buy yourself a personality, maybe some decent clothes while you are at it. He thrust the money toward my chest. I stared at his pale hand, my jaw clenched tight. I kept my hands at my sides, refusing his pathetic offering. Jada giggled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Preston sighed, feigning deep disappointment. He let the bill slip from his fingers to the polished marble floor. Then, maintaining steady eye contact, he lifted his Italian leather shoe and ground the $100 bill into the dirt, tracked in from the valet stand. Desmond walked up behind them. Instead of reprimanding his son-in-law for publicly humiliating his daughter, Desmond actually chuckled. He stepped forward and clapped Preston hard on the back, like old friends sharing an inside joke. Desmond, Preston said smoothly, looking from the crushed bill back up to my father. Do not be too hard on her. Genetics play a part, you know. She just does not have the proper pedigree for our kind of world. Desmond nodded approvingly, looking at me with absolute disdain. Preston was right. In Desmond's eyes, this arrogant white man was the son he had always wanted, and I was just the genetic mistake that had somehow managed to infiltrate his perfect black dynasty. I did not say a single word in my defense. I knew that speaking would only give them the sick satisfaction of hearing my voice break. I shoved my shoulder past Preston, pushing the heavy glass doors open with all the strength I had left in my body. The cold night air slammed into my face. The rain was coming down in thick, violent sheets, bouncing off the pavement and soaking through my dress instantly. The valet attendant stepped forward with an umbrella and asked if he should pull my car around. I completely ignored him. I could not stand on that pristine driveway for another second. I had packed a small overnight bag earlier that day, intending to stay at a nearby hotel after the gala, simply to avoid driving back to the estate. I grabbed my suitcase from the coat check counter and started walking. I marched straight down the long, winding driveway of the exclusive country club and stepped right onto the dark, unlit highway. The heavy rain plastered my hair to my face and neck. My shoes splashed in deep, muddy puddles, completely ruining the expensive heels I had saved up for months to buy. Cars sped past me in the dark, spraying dirty water against my bare legs, but I kept putting one foot in front of the other. The highway was completely desolate, surrounded by dense Georgia pine trees that looked like towering black shadows in the raging storm. The streetlights flickered intermittently overhead, casting long, eerie shapes across the wet asphalt. I was freezing cold, physically exhausted, and utterly broken inside. I just wanted to disappear into the night and never look back. My chest heaved with quiet sobs as I dragged the heavy suitcase over the uneven gravel shoulder. I was completely consumed by my own misery, entirely unaware of my surroundings. Suddenly, a massive black SUV roared up from the darkness behind me. It did not just drive past like the other vehicles. It swerved sharply toward me, the thick tires screeching loudly against the wet pavement, as it aggressively cut me off and blocked my path on the shoulder of the road. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I froze in my tracks, my grip tightening on the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles turned white. The heavy rain completely obscured the dark-tinted windows of the imposing vehicle. Before I could turn around and run back in the opposite direction, the two back doors of the vehicle flung open simultaneously. Two incredibly large men dressed in dark tailored suits jumped out into the pouring rain. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed, stepping directly into my path and cutting off any possible chance of escape. I gasped and took a stumbling step backward, my pulse roaring in my ears over the sound of the pouring rain. My mind raced through every terrible scenario imaginable. I dropped my suitcase, ready to scream for help, ready to fight for my life right there on the side of the dark road. But neither of the suited men reached out to grab me. Instead, they simply stood perfectly still, flanking the open doors of the luxury car, like highly trained bodyguards. The interior lights of the SUV suddenly clicked on, illuminating the back seat. An older, impeccably dressed African-American man sat inside, staring directly at me. His expression was incredibly kind. He did not look like a man who had come here to hurt me. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on a silver cane, and looked at me with deep tears welling in his warm brown eyes. "Hello, dear," he said gently. "I am your biological father." I stared at the man. The sound of the raging storm outside suddenly muffled as the heavy doors of the SUV slammed shut. The lock clicked, trapping me inside a cabin that smelled of rich cedar and expensive leather. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wiped the cold rain from my eyes, certain I had misheard him over the adrenaline rushing through my ears. I backed away, pressing my shoulders against the damp leather of the door panel. I demanded to know what kind of sick joke this was. I told him if Desmond or Preston had hired him to scare me into coming back to the estate, they were wasting their time. I reached for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the polished chrome as I prepared to fight my way back out into the freezing storm. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched me with a sorrow so deep it paralyzed my hand on the door. He told me he knew all about Desmond Sterling. He knew about the abuse. He knew about the country club incident that had happened just 30 minutes ago. He had been having me followed, watching from the shadows until the moment was right to step in and keep me safe. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that scraped my throat. I told him he had the wrong girl. I defensively repeated the vile story Camille had drilled into my head since I was old enough to understand words. I told this stranger that my real parents were nameless addicts living under a highway overpass in downtown Atlanta. I told him they traded me to Desmond Sterling for a handful of cash to buy their next fix. I explained how Camille would proudly recount that story to her wealthy friends at charity luncheons, pointing at me as the ultimate proof of her boundless Christian charity. I told him the Sterlings were my saviors, even if they were cruel, because they had rescued me from the absolute bottom of the gutter. The older man closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down his weathered cheek. He gripped the silver head of his cane until his knuckles turned pale. He told me the Sterlings were monsters. He told me they had spun a web of lies so thick and legally complex that it took him decades to cut through it to find me. He introduced himself properly. His name was Elijah Montgomery. The name sent an immediate shockwave through my brain. Even working independently in corporate restructuring, I knew exactly who Elijah Montgomery was. Everyone in the financial sector knew the name, though few had ever seen his face. He was a phantom in the corporate world, a billionaire hedge fund titan who controlled Montgomery Holdings. He owned entire city blocks, funded massive political campaigns, and could destroy rival corporations with a single phone call. He was notoriously private, completely avoiding the flashy galas and society magazines that Desmond Sterling constantly craved. I looked closely at his face in the soft amber glow of the cabin lights. I saw the sharp angle of my own jawline. I saw the exact same almond-shaped brown eyes that stared back at me in the mirror every morning. A terrifying, undeniable realization began to bloom in my chest. My corporate instincts, the very skills I used to dismantle failing companies, kicked in. I looked at his expensive tailored suit, the armored vehicle, the highly trained security detail. This man did not need to play games with a broken 28-year-old woman. He had no reason to lie. Elijah reached onto the seat beside him. He picked up a thick, heavy black leather-bound financial dossier and placed it gently on the center console between us. He told me that in our world, numbers never lie. He told me to open it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely untie the string closure. I flipped open the heavy leather cover, expecting to see bank statements or stock portfolios. The first page was a photograph. It was an old Polaroid of a beautiful, vibrant black woman laughing in a sunlit park. I gasped, dropping the folder onto my lap. All the breath left my lungs. It was like looking at a ghost. The woman had my exact smile. She had my hair. She had my precise facial structure. Elijah touched the edge of the photograph with a trembling finger. He told me her name was Maya. She was not a homeless addict. She was a brilliant software developer, a pioneer in early financial algorithms. She was the absolute love of his life. He explained that they were young and building their lives together when Maya discovered she was pregnant. But Elijah had powerful enemies back then, ruthless corporate competitors who wanted to ruin him and steal his assets. To protect Maya and their unborn baby, he sent her into hiding in Atlanta under an assumed name while he stayed in New York to fight a brutal financial war. He thought she was safe. He thought he had shielded us from the danger. Elijah leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady register. He tapped the leather folder lying on my knees. He told me Desmond Sterling was Maya's assigned estate lawyer at the time. Desmond was a nobody back then, just a greedy, desperate attorney looking for a shortcut to wealth and high society. Maya had trusted him to manage her affairs while she waited for Elijah to return. I looked down at the documents beneath the photograph. I saw faded ink official state stamps and complex legal jargon. There were bank transfers, falsified accident reports, forged adoption papers with Desmond's unmistakable signature at the bottom. My entire life had been a meticulously crafted legal fiction. Elijah reached out and gently covered my shaking hands with his own warm, steady hands. He looked me dead in the eye. The sadness in his gaze completely vanished, replaced by a chilling absolute fury that mirrored my own awakening rage. "They did not save you from the streets, Nia," he said, his voice ringing with a terrifying truth. "They stole you. And they used your mother's blood to build their entire empire." I stared at the yellowed, watermarked pages inside the heavy leather dossier. The complex financial tables and dense legal jargon blurred together for a fraction of a second before snapping into sharp, agonizing focus. My corporate training took over, translating the numbers into a horrifying narrative. Elijah tapped a weathered bank statement with a sleek gold pen, his hand shaking slightly. Maya held a patent for a predictive trading algorithm. He explained, his voice thick with a mixture of immense pride and crushing grief. It was revolutionary for its time. It was worth tens of millions of dollars. But before she could finalize the sale and secure her future, her car was run off a slick mountain road outside the city limits. The police filed a brief report, called it a tragic accident, and closed the case within 48 hours. Elijah leaned back heavily against the plush leather seat of the SUV, the ambient streetlights casting long shadows across his face. Desmond Sterling was just a low-level, struggling estate lawyer back then assigned by the state to handle Maya's affairs. I flipped the page, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I was looking at a heavily redacted trust fund document. $15 million. It was an ironclad financial trust set up explicitly for my care, my education, and my future, completely shielded from outside hands. But the very next page showed a massive transfer authorization. The signature at the bottom was Desmond's. He forged the adoption papers to gain total legal control over my life, deliberately buried the existence of the trust, and illegally liquidated every single penny to purchase the foundational commercial real estate for Sterling Enterprises. He did not build his massive empire with legendary grit and superior business acumen like he claimed in every magazine interview. He built it with my mother's life and my stolen future. The physical throbbing pain in my jaw from Desmond's violent slap was completely eclipsed by the sickening betrayal twisting like a knife in my stomach. Every vicious insult, every discarded Christmas present, every time Camille made me sleep in the unheated guest house while Jada paraded around the estate in imported designer clothes suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It was not just cruel, thoughtless favoritism. It was a calculated psychological war designed to keep me so broken, so financially dependent, and so desperate for their basic approval that I would never dare question my origins. They needed me submissive. They needed me entirely blind to the fact that I was the rightful owner of the very empire they used to crush my spirit every single day. Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek encrypted satellite phone. "My legal team is on standby, Nia," he said, his thumb hovering purposefully over the illuminated screen. "We have enough hard evidence in this single folder to trigger a massive federal investigation by sunrise. I can have Desmond and his entire board of directors in handcuffs before they even finish their morning coffee. We can freeze their assets, seize their properties, and destroy them completely by tomorrow morning." I looked at the glowing screen of his phone. Then I looked out the dark-tinted window at the pouring rain washing over the empty highway. A slow, dark laugh bubbled up from the very depths of my chest. It startled even me. It was cold, cynical, and entirely devoid of fear or hesitation. I reached out and gently pushed Elijah's hand down, lowering the phone. "No," I said, my voice steady and surprisingly calm. "A lawsuit is just a business transaction to men like Desmond. They hire armies of ruthless defense attorneys. They tie up the federal courts for a decade with endless appeals and injunctions. They eventually settle without ever admitting guilt, and they retire comfortably to a private island somewhere in the Caribbean. That is not justice. That is just an expensive inconvenience." Elijah raised a gray eyebrow, clearly taken aback by my reaction. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, studying my face intently. I looked him dead in the eye, letting the corporate predator inside me take the wheel. "I am a corporate restructuring executive," I explained, tapping the financial documents in my lap. "I do not just sue failing companies. I dismantle them. I perform hostile takeovers. I find the rotting, corrupt beams in their financial foundation. I sever their crucial lifelines, and I watch the entire structure collapse in on itself. A lawsuit gives them a chance to fight back behind corporate shields. I want to tear them down from the inside out. I want to bleed them dry and watch them feel the exact moment they lose absolutely everything they love." Elijah studied my face for a long, silent moment. I saw a brilliant spark of recognition in his eyes, a shared, ruthless business instinct passing silently between biological father and daughter. "How do you plan to get inside?" he asked, his tone shifting from protective father to strategic partner. "Desmond is notoriously paranoid. He keeps his corporate servers locked down tighter than a military base." I smiled, thinking of my arrogant, insufferable brother-in-law grinding that $100 bill into the dirt. "Desmond is paranoid," I agreed. "But Preston is sloppy. Preston is the chief financial officer, and his massive white privilege makes him believe he is the smartest, most untouchable man in any room he walks into. He operates half of the Sterling Empire's shadow accounts and offshore transfers right from his home office in the mansion. He brings his work laptop home every single night and leaves it sitting right on his mahogany desk. To get to those heavily guarded financial servers, I do not need a team of expensive corporate hackers. I just have to walk right through the front door." Elijah frowned deeply, shaking his head in immediate protest. They just humiliated you in front of half the city's elite, he argued. They threw you out into a violent storm. If you go back there now, they will treat you like dirt. They will abuse you worse than before. I closed the heavy leather dossier and handed it back to him. I know exactly how they will treat me, I said, reaching for the door handle of the SUV. I am going to walk back into that lion's den tomorrow morning. I will apologize for ruining their perfect evening. I will put my head down. I will play the pathetic, broken, submissive daughter who realized she simply cannot survive in the real world without their generous charity. They will be so blinded by their own towering arrogance, so absolutely thrilled to see me crawling back to take their abuse, that they will never notice I am planting the virus that will burn their entire world to ashes. The morning sun was glaringly bright as Elijah's discreet town car dropped me off a block away from the sprawling Sterling estate in Buckhead. I walked the rest of the way, letting the humidity cling to my skin. I needed to look pathetic. I needed to look like the broken, humiliated daughter who had spent the night shivering in the rain, coming to her senses. The towering wrought iron gates swung open, revealing the meticulously manicured lawns and the massive brick facade of the house built on my mother's stolen legacy. I took a deep breath, burying my rage behind a perfectly crafted mask of submission, and walked through the heavy oak front doors. Camille was sitting in the sunlit breakfast nook, casually sipping a mimosa and scrolling through a tablet. She did not even look up when my wet shoes squeaked against the pristine marble floor. I stood there for a long moment, forcing my shoulders to slump. I apologized. I told her I had overreacted last night, that the pressure of my job had gotten to me, and that I was sorry for embarrassing the family. Camille finally lowered her tablet, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her flawless face. She looked at my damp clothes and ruined hair with absolute satisfaction. Finally realized you cannot survive without our charity, she sneered. You always throw these little tantrums, Nia, but you always come crawling back. We provide everything for you, and yet you act like a wild animal. Now go clean up the old guest house out back. Preston and Jada are expanding their living space, and they are moving into your old bedroom today. Take your trash out of there before they arrive. The guest house was a dilapidated structure near the property line, completely uninsulated and mostly used for storing broken patio furniture. A few days ago, the sheer indignity of being kicked out of my own childhood bedroom to make way for my sister's arrogant husband would have crushed me. Today, it was the greatest strategic advantage they could have possibly handed me. I lowered my eyes, murmured a quiet apology, and walked up the grand sweeping staircase to my room. When I pushed open the door to my bedroom, the invasion had already begun. Preston's expensive golf clubs were tossed carelessly onto my bed, and a stack of his custom-tailored suits hung from my closet door. He was standing near the window, loudly berating a moving company employee over his cell phone. But more importantly, his primary work laptop was sitting wide open on my vintage writing desk, plugged into a docking station he had clearly just unpacked. This was the exact machine he used to manage the shadow accounts for Sterling Enterprises. I kept my head down and started quietly packing my clothes into a duffel bag, moving like a shadow. Preston ended his call, letting out an annoyed sigh. He noticed me packing and leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He told me to hurry up, complaining that my cheap perfume was ruining the aesthetic of his new home office. I did not snap back. I did not defend myself. I simply nodded and moved toward the desk to gather my remaining books. My hands moved with the practiced, invisible speed of a corporate auditor collecting restricted files. Hidden in the palm of my right hand was a microscopic USB keylogger provided to me by Elijah's elite security team just hours earlier. It was no larger than a fingernail, designed to bypass enterprise-grade firewalls and transmit every single keystroke directly to a secure offshore server. As I reached across the desk to grab a stack of novels, I brushed my hand against the back of Preston's docking station. With a single, silent click, the hardware locked into the hidden port. It was completely undetectable. Preston scoffed, telling me to be careful with his equipment because it was worth more than my annual salary. I offered him a meek, trembling apology, hoisted my heavy duffel bag over my shoulder, and walked out of the room. I had full access to his entire digital life, and he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the mirror to even notice. I dragged my bags down the back staircase and headed toward the kitchen exit that led out to the guest house. The hallway was dark and quiet, passing directly behind Desmond's private soundproofed study. As I walked past the heavy oak doors, I noticed they were unlatched left open, just a fraction of an inch. Desmond was famously paranoid about closing doors, which meant someone had stormed in there in a hurry. I stopped dead in my tracks. Through the narrow crack, I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass, followed by Preston's frantic, hushed voice. The arrogant swagger from upstairs was completely gone. He sounded terrified. "We cannot just shift the numbers again," Desmond Preston hissed, his voice vibrating with panic. "I am telling you, the financial walls are closing in. Apex Holdings just initiated a hostile credit freeze." Desmond growled back, telling Preston to pull himself together and just forge the quarterly asset reports like they always did. He insisted that the real estate market would bounce back, that they just needed to borrow a little more from the corporate reserves to cover the gaps. "Borrow from what reserves?" Preston shot back, his voice cracking. "The audit is coming in exactly 2 weeks. Do you not understand what I am saying? The liquidity is gone. If the federal auditors look closely at the ledger and find out the employee pension funds are missing, we are both going to federal prison." I stood frozen in the dark hallway, my breath catching in my throat. Pension funds. They were not just running a failing real estate firm. Desmond and Preston were actively embezzling the life savings of their own employees to fund their luxurious lifestyle. I tightened my grip on the strap of my duffel bag, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. I had come back to find a crack in their foundation. Instead, they had just handed me the dynamite. 2 days later, the trap was fully set. I had spent 48 hours playing the role of the silent, grateful ghost in the guest house, scrubbing floors, organizing storage boxes, and staying entirely out of their way. By the time the weekly Sunday family dinner rolled around, they had completely dropped their guard. The Sterling dining room was a monument to excessive, suffocating wealth, featuring a massive mahogany table positioned beneath a cascading crystal chandelier that cast a cold, brilliant light over the room. I sat at the very far end of the table, staring down at my untouched plate of roasted duck and wild rice. Jada sat opposite me, swirling a flute of vintage champagne with perfectly manicured fingers. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a familiar venomous sneer. She asked if I was intentionally trying to ruin their appetite with my depressing presence. She gestured sharply to my simple black sweater and faded denim jeans, asking if we were calling my aesthetic thrift store chic now. She told me that if I was going to eat their expensive food and live on their pristine property, the absolute least I could do was not look like I had just crawled out of a charity donation bin. I kept my eyes lowered to my plate. I offered a quiet, submissive apology, letting her believe her petty insults still possessed the power to break me. Preston strutted into the formal dining room a few minutes late, holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch. He loosened his silk tie and dropped into the high-backed chair next to Jada, exuding the smug, suffocating satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire world. He raised his glass to Desmond, launching into a boastful, loud monologue about the firm's latest quarterly financial projections. He absolutely loved using these Sunday dinners to stroke his own massive ego, wrapping his blatant racism in thin, polite layers of corporate jargon. He leaned forward, telling Desmond that Sterling Enterprises had always possessed a certain raw urban hustle, but it desperately needed someone with his specific Ivy League sophistication to truly legitimize the operation. He claimed he was elevating their primitive business acumen, transforming a disorganized street-level venture into a civilized top-tier financial institution. He said it took a very particular kind of pedigree to understand high-level market nuances, implying heavily that such intellect could never be taught in the rough neighborhoods where Desmond originally started out. Instead of recognizing the deeply insulting, condescending nature of the comment, Desmond actually beamed with intense pride. He raised his own wine glass, thanking Preston for bringing his superior intellect and cultured background to the family. It was absolutely sickening to watch my father grovel for the approval of a white man who openly despised everything about our heritage. Desmond set his glass down on the crisp linen tablecloth and turned his attention directly to me. The warm, fatherly expression he had just bestowed upon Preston instantly hardened into cold, absolute disdain. He told me that my little runaway stunt at the country club gala had caused a lot of unnecessary gossip among his wealthy business partners. He said that letting me move back into the dilapidated guest house was a massive, unearned favor, and in the Sterling family, absolutely nothing came without a steep price. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder, sliding it forcefully across the polished mahogany wood. It stopped right in front of my plate, the heavy paper stark against the delicate china. He ordered me to sign it immediately. He claimed it was just a standard liability waiver for the family trust. He stated that since I was currently living under his roof rent-free and displaying clear signs of severe emotional instability, Preston had graciously drafted the document to protect the family assets from any future erratic behavior on my part. Preston chimed in from across the table, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch. He told me not to worry my pretty little head about the big words on the page, assuring me with a condescending wink that it was just basic boilerplate protection for the estate. He slid a heavy gold fountain pen across the table, demanding my signature on the bottom line. I picked up the pen, allowing my hands to tremble perfectly on cue. I opened the folder, my eyes dropping to the dense, single-spaced paragraphs printed on the heavy cardstock. To Desmond and Preston, this was an impenetrable wall of legal intimidation designed specifically to blind a naive, desperate, and broken woman. But they had completely forgotten who they were dealing with. I was a senior corporate restructuring executive. I spent 60 hours a week dissecting complex hostile merger agreements, identifying predatory legal loopholes, and dismantling fraudulent corporate entities. To me, this intimidating document was written in my absolute native language. I seamlessly deployed my specialized expertise speed reading through the meaningless introductory fluff and zeroing in on the critical indemnification clauses buried halfway down the third page. My blood ran ice cold as my brain rapidly processed the true legal structure of the trap they had just handed me. This was not a standard liability waiver. There was absolutely no mention of the family trust property protections or personal medical liability. I immediately recognized the name of the corporate entity listed in the primary fiduciary clause. It was the exact shadow shell company Preston used to illegally process the employee pension funds. I scanned the final paragraph, tracing the severe legal ramifications of the signature line at the bottom of the page. The document was a total unconditional transfer of fiduciary responsibility. It explicitly named the signatory as the sole legal guarantor and primary managing director of the shell company, permanently absorbing all existing financial liabilities, hidden corporate debts, and potential criminal penalties associated with its offshore accounts. They were not protecting the family estate from my supposed instability. They were actively using me as their human shield. Preston and Desmond knew the federal audit was going to expose the missing pension funds in exactly 2 weeks. They needed a disposable scapegoat, someone entirely expendable to take the devastating fall for the massive embezzlement scheme that would inevitably send them both to federal prison. If I signed my name on that dotted line, the entire paper trail of the stolen millions would legally and definitively terminate with me. They were going to let me go to a maximum security prison for the rest of my natural life, just to save their own skins. I kept my head bowed, hiding the terrifying crystal-clear realization burning in my eyes. I gripped the gold fountain pen tightly, a cold, dark thrill racing through my veins as I comprehended the absolute magnitude of their fatal miscalculation. I stared at the dotted line, my mind racing through the exact mathematical trajectory of their trap. Refusing to sign would instantly blow my cover. They would know I understood the legal jargon, and Preston would immediately lock down the servers. But signing my actual name to their fraudulent document was an absolute death sentence. I needed a distraction. I needed a window of total chaos. I let my hand shake violently, dropping the heavy gold fountain pen onto the polished mahogany table. I gasped, pressing a hand to my chest, and forced a sudden, violent coughing fit. I hacked and wheezed, my shoulders heaving as if I were choking on the dry, roasted duck. Desmond slammed his hand on the table, barking at me to control myself. Jada groaned, complaining that I was intentionally ruining the vintage champagne with my disgusting display. I reached desperately for my crystal water goblet, my hands trembling with perfectly calculated clumsiness. As I brought the heavy glass toward my mouth, I let it slip through my fingers. The goblet tipped forward, pouring 30 ounces of ice-cold water directly into Preston's lap. The formal dining room erupted. Preston shrieked a high and undignified sound, leaping out of his chair so fast it tipped over backwards and crashed against the hardwood floor. He swore violently, slapping at his ruined silk trousers, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. Camille gasped in sympathy, rushing to grab linen napkins, while Jada yelled at me to watch what I was doing. Desmond stood up, his booming voice adding to the immediate, overwhelming noise. For exactly 12 seconds, no one was looking at the manila folder sitting on the table. I moved with the precision of a ghost. I slid my left hand into the oversized pocket of my cheap cardigan. My fingers closed around a folded sheet of heavy legal stock paper. I had spent the early hours of the morning in a secure boardroom with Elijah and his team of ruthless corporate litigators. They had anticipated Desmond would try to legally bind me to his sinking ship. They had drafted a counter-agreement matching the exact font margin width and paper weight of the standard Sterling Enterprises corporate contracts. I smoothly flipped to the final page of Desmond's folder, slid his signature page out, and seamlessly slipped my document into its place. My swapped page did not make me the guarantor of their fraudulent shell company. It was a legally binding assignment of liability. By executing the document, the primary shareholders of Sterling Enterprises unknowingly signed over their entire personal estates, all liquid assets, and all corporate holdings as direct collateral to Montgomery Holdings. If the company defaulted on a single cent, Elijah would instantly own every car, every bank account, and the very roof over their heads. The chaos around the table finally subsided. Preston stood trembling with absolute rage, clutching a wet napkin to his crotch. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Desmond marched around the table, his face a mask of furious impatience. He slammed his hand flat on the table right next to the folder. He told me I was a clumsy, pathetic embarrassment to the family name. He pointed a rigid finger at the gold pen resting near my plate. He ordered me to sign the document right that second and get out of his sight. I ducked my head, letting a few calculated tears spill hot over my cheeks. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers. I did not hesitate. I scrawled my signature across the bottom of the page, playing the role of the terrified, submissive daughter to absolute perfection. Before the ink could even dry, Desmond snatched the thick folder right out from under my hands. He flipped to the back page, his eyes darting immediately to the signature line. He completely ignored the altered legal text sitting just 3 inches above my name. His massive ego simply could not process the idea that I was capable of outsmarting him. Desmond closed the folder with a sharp, satisfying snap. He looked down at me, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. "Good girl," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Now go wash the dishes." I stood up silently, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor, and gathered the dirty plates. I spent the next hour standing at the marble sink, washing the delicate china by hand, while my family drank scotch and laughed in the adjoining parlor. They thought they had just secured their ultimate escape route. They thought they had successfully pinned their impending federal prison sentences directly onto my shoulders. Every time Preston laughed, a cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. Hours later, the massive house finally went dark. I sat alone on the thin mattress in the freezing, damp guest house. I reached under the bed and pulled out the sleek, encrypted laptop Elijah had given me. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room as I booted the system. I initiated the secure connection linking directly to the microscopic keylogger I had planted on Preston's docking station earlier that morning. It took less than 3 minutes to bypass his sloppy security protocols and access the primary Sterling Enterprises financial server. I opened the hidden ledgers expecting to find the standard sloppy embezzlement Preston had panicked about in the study. I expected to see the employee pension funds drained and funneled into private offshore accounts. But as my eyes scanned the cascading rows of data, my breath caught in my throat. I began cross-referencing the incoming investor capital with the outgoing shell company transfers. The numbers were astronomical. The pension funds were just a tiny drop in a massive, terrifying ocean. Preston and Desmond were not just stealing from their employees. They were running a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. They were using fake real estate developments to secure massive loans from international investors, using new money to pay off the old debt. And the entire house of cards was just days away from a spectacular, catastrophic collapse. I kept digging into the encrypted files, the glow of the screen illuminating the damp walls of the guest house. The sheer audacity of Desmond's fraud was breathtaking, but it was the secondary extraction protocol buried deep within the network architecture that truly caught my attention. Preston was not just a willing partner in Desmond's massive Ponzi scheme. He was actively bleeding the operation dry from the inside out. He was a parasite feeding on a predator. Tracing the digital routing numbers through a labyrinth of corporate obfuscation, I watched tens of millions of dollars bypass the firm's primary ledgers entirely. The capital was being filtered through a complex web of anonymous shell companies, tumbling through banks in Cyprus and Malta, before finally vanishing into a highly secured offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. I ran a comprehensive cross-reference on the Cayman account's primary beneficiary. It did not belong to Preston. It certainly did not belong to Jada. The account was registered to a woman named Chloe Vance. I used the microscopic keylogger data to cleanly bypass the two-factor authentication on Preston's personal email and his private encrypted cloud storage. The folders were overflowing with hundreds of high-resolution photographs and digital receipts. Chloe Vance was a stunning blonde art appraiser, living in a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, an apartment completely paid for by the stolen Sterling Enterprises funds. The financial records were utterly damning, but the travel itineraries were the final fatal nail in the coffin. Preston had purchased 2 one-way first-class tickets to Geneva, Switzerland. The departure date was scheduled for exactly 48 hours before the federal auditors were set to arrive at the Sterling corporate headquarters. He was systematically draining the final liquid assets of the entire firm, preparing to vanish into the night with his mistress. He was going to leave Desmond completely bankrupt, and he was going to leave his devoted, arrogant wife to face the crushing weight of multiple federal indictments alone. It was time to introduce a little well-calculated chaos into their perfect, pristine ecosystem. I downloaded a particularly vivid photograph from Preston's hidden digital cache. It showed him and Chloe Vance lounging on the deck of a private chartered yacht in Monaco, their arms wrapped tightly around each other in a passionate, undeniable kiss. Using a heavily encrypted, untraceable offshore server provided by Elijah's security team, I routed a single anonymous text message directly to Jada's personal cell phone. I attached the photograph with absolutely no caption. I closed my laptop, slipped quietly out of the dilapidated guest house, and walked through the deep shadows of the manicured gardens toward the main house to watch the fallout. I stood completely still in the darkened formal dining room, peering silently through the French doors into the grand marble hallway. Jada came storming down the sweeping curved staircase, her face entirely devoid of color. Her hands were visibly shaking as she clutched her expensive phone, her knuckles turning white. She intercepted Preston just as he was walking out of Desmond's private study. Her voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, a shrill, piercing mixture of total devastation and absolute rage. She shoved the phone directly into his chest, screaming at him to explain the photograph. For a fraction of a second, Preston froze, his eyes darting to the screen. But he was a clinical sociopath, a master manipulator who never truly lost his footing. He let out a loud, condescending laugh, tossing his head back, as if she had just shown him a hilarious joke. He wrapped his large hands firmly around Jada's trembling wrists, pulling her close and looking deeply into her eyes with an expression of profound manufactured pity. He told her she was being completely ridiculous. He claimed the image was a blatant amateur deepfake generated by an artificial intelligence program. And then, with flawless, terrifying precision, he pivoted the blame entirely onto me. He lowered his voice to a soothing, poisonous whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet marble hall. He told Jada that I had photoshopped the image in a desperate, sick attempt to destroy their beautiful marriage. He said I was deeply, pathetically obsessed with him. He claimed I was consumed by bitter, relentless jealousy over Jada's perfect life, her immense wealth, and her flawless husband. He stroked her hair, kissing her forehead gently, telling her that I was a broken, vindictive woman trying to tear the family apart from the inside out because I was entirely incapable of securing a successful man of my own. Jada's fragile, desperate ego eagerly absorbed every single lie. It was far easier for her to actively demonize the sister she already hated than to face the crushing, humiliating reality that her golden husband was a traitor. I slipped back out the side door, hurrying quietly across the wet grass to the guest house. I barely had time to sit down at my small wooden desk and open my decoy work laptop before the heavy door violently crashed open, bouncing off the wall. Jada stood in the doorframe, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with misdirected, blinding fury. She marched across the concrete floor, raising her hand high, and delivered a vicious, stinging slap directly across my left cheek. The sudden impact snapped my head sharply to the side, my skin burning with a hot, immediate sting. "Stay away from my husband, you pathetic loser!" Jada screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She did not wait for me to offer a response or a defense. She grabbed the heavy laptop sitting on my desk, hoisted it high above her head, and slammed it down onto the hard concrete floor with incredible force. The casing cracked with a loud, sickening crunch. She stomped the heel of her expensive designer shoe directly into the center of the screen, shattering the delicate glass into 100 glittering broken shards. She leaned over me, her face contorted with unhinged rage, warning me that if I ever tried to sabotage her marriage again, she would personally ensure Desmond threw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing. She spun on her heel and stormed out into the night, slamming the door so hard the flimsy walls of the guest house physically shook. I sat perfectly still in the quiet, damp room, gently touching my stinging cheek with the tips of my fingers. I looked down at the destroyed hardware scattered across the floor. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Jada truly believed she had just destroyed all of my files and severed my access to the truth. She had absolutely no idea that I was light years ahead of their predictable, violent reactions. Every single financial document, every offshore routing number, and every high-resolution photograph of Preston's mistress was already safely locked away in Elijah's impenetrable cloud server. The trap was completely set, and they were sprinting directly into it. The shattered glass of my decoy laptop was swept into the trash the very next morning, leaving absolutely no trace of Jada's unhinged tantrum. The Sterling household immediately shifted its frantic energy toward the next major social event on their crowded calendar. Camille was hosting her highly publicized annual spring charity luncheon, an exclusive invite-only gathering designed specifically to flaunt her immense wealth and solidify her position at the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. The grand conservatory of the Sterling estate had been completely transformed into a breathtaking sea of white orchids, towering crystal centerpieces, and silk-draped tables. But Camille could not simply enjoy her lavish party. She needed to ensure I understood exactly where I ranked in her kingdom. Instead of allowing me to remain out of sight in the guest house, Camille explicitly ordered me to work the event. She did not assign me a background role in the catering kitchen or the staging area. She forced me to stand at the front entrance wearing a stiff, humiliating black uniform to work as the designated coat check girl. She wanted every single wealthy socialite, corporate executive, and political ally walking through those heavy oak doors to see Desmond Sterling's supposedly erratic, disgraced daughter reduced to menial labor. I stood behind the polished mahogany counter for 3 hours, silently taking designer wraps, silk shawls, and expensive cashmere coats from women draped in diamonds. They offered me looks of profound condescending pity mixed with barely concealed disgust. Camille made it a point to parade her most elite friends past my station, pausing just long enough to offer a loud theatrical sigh about how she was generously trying to teach me the value of honest hard work. I kept my face entirely blank. I nodded politely, handed out numbered brass tags, and carefully hung their garments. I let them enjoy their temporary superiority. I knew the exact offshore routing numbers Preston was using to drain their accounts. I knew the federal auditors were closing in. They were standing on a trapdoor, and my hand was resting firmly on the lever. I watched Preston and Jada glide through the crowd, playing the role of the perfect power couple, though Jada's smile looked incredibly brittle and her eyes frequently darted toward her husband's phone. When the champagne brunch concluded, the guests filtered into the main ballroom for the highlight of the afternoon, the live luxury auction. I abandoned my post at the front door, slipping quietly into the shadows at the very back of the ballroom to observe. The auctioneer moved swiftly through expensive vacation packages and private yacht charters. Then the room dimmed. A single dramatic spotlight illuminated the center stage. Camille glided up the carpeted steps, her face glowing with absolute triumph. She carried a sleek black velvet box in her hands. She opened the case, and a collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy attendees. Nestled against the dark velvet was a breathtaking vintage emerald and diamond necklace. The stones were massive, flawless, and set in intricate custom platinum filigree. Camille stepped up to the microphone, her voice dripping with venomous, calculated sweetness. She announced that this particular item was not a standard donation. She claimed the piece had a very complicated, sordid history. She told the captivated audience that the necklace had originally belonged to a wretched, unstable woman who owed the Sterling family a massive, unpayable debt. Camille smiled cruelly, her eyes scanning the room before landing directly on me standing in the shadows. She stated that the family was finally collecting on that debt, offering this beautiful piece of reclaimed property for the benefit of charity. My heart stopped dead in my chest. The air physically rushed out of my lungs, leaving me dizzy and completely paralyzed. My vision narrowed exclusively to the glittering green stones resting in Camille's hands. I knew that necklace. I had never seen it in person, but its image was permanently burned into my memory. Just a few weeks ago, inside the secure, soundproofed walls of Elijah's corporate headquarters, his elite investigative team had handed me a thick dossier detailing the complete systematic theft of my biological mother's legacy. Tucked inside that file was a faded, grainy photograph of my mother holding me as a newborn. Around her neck was that exact, unmistakable emerald filigree. Camille had not simply stolen my mother's patents, her company, and her life's work. She had physically stripped the family heirlooms from her estate during the hostile takeover. Now she was parading my mother's stolen jewelry in front of Atlanta's elite, using my profound trauma as a cheap, entertaining anecdote to drive up the bidding. A wave of primal, violent rage crashed over me, so intense my hands physically shook. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they bled, forcing myself to remain rooted to the floor. I could not break cover. I could not give Camille the satisfaction of a public reaction. The auctioneer took the microphone, starting the bidding at $50,000. The room erupted into a frenzy of raised paddles. The wealthy socialites desperately wanted the notorious piece. The price skyrocketed to $100,000, then $200,000. Camille stood on the stage, vibrating with sheer unapologetic greed, her eyes wide as the numbers climbed higher and higher. She was absolutely intoxicated by the wealth pouring in from her stolen prize. The bidding finally slowed at $250,000. The auctioneer called out, going once, going twice, raising his wooden gavel into the air. Suddenly, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. A man standing at the very back of the room, positioned directly opposite my hiding spot, stepped out of the shadows. He wore an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, and his posture radiated absolute, terrifying power. He did not hold a numbered paddle. He simply raised his hand. He announced a bid of $1 million, stating clearly and loudly that the offer was placed on behalf of a completely anonymous buyer. The entire ballroom descended into total stunned silence. Heads whipped around to stare at the man in the gray suit. Camille froze on the stage, her jaw dropping open in utter shock. $1 million for a vintage piece of jewelry was an astronomical, completely unprecedented overpayment. Suspicion flickered across Camille's heavily powdered face. She stared at the man, clearly trying to calculate his identity and the angle of this sudden, massive influx of cash. But Camille's arrogance was only eclipsed by her endless, consuming avarice. The sheer thought of $1 million transaction blinded her to the very obvious danger standing in her ballroom. She turned to the auctioneer, her eyes wide with manic delight, and nodded frantically. The auctioneer slammed the heavy wooden gavel down onto the podium. Sold. The echo of the heavy wooden gavel rang through the silent, opulent ballroom. Camille stood completely frozen on the brightly lit stage, her hands trembling around the black velvet box. The gray-suited representative did not smile. He did not step forward to collect the necklace. Instead, he smoothly withdrew a sleek silver tablet from the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. His voice carried effortlessly across the room, polite, but carrying an undercurrent of absolute, uncompromising steel. He informed Camille that the $1 million was currently sitting in a secure bonded escrow account. He stated that the funds would be released to the Sterling Foundation the exact second his client's designated independent accounting firm completed a mandatory comprehensive compliance audit of the charity's financial ledgers. He casually checked his heavy platinum watch, adding that the audit team was currently parked in the estate's circular driveway, waiting to begin their immediate inspection. The blood drained entirely from Camille's face, leaving her heavily contoured skin looking like dull gray ash. A collective, fascinated murmur rippled through the crowd of elite socialites. $1 million donation always came with stipulations, but an immediate hostile audit of a private charity was a massive public insult. Camille let out a high, brittle laugh, desperately trying to project an air of calm sophistication. She gripped the microphone tightly, her knuckles turning white, and attempted to dismiss the demand as highly unorthodox and entirely unnecessary. The representative remained absolutely immovable. He stated loudly, ensuring the front rows heard every single syllable, that a transparent financial audit was a non-negotiable condition of the anonymous buyer. If she refused the audit, he would withdraw the $1 million bid immediately. Camille had absolutely no choice. The wealthy women staring up at her were already whispering behind their champagne flutes, sensing blood in the water. She forced a strained, terrified smile and agreed to the terms. The luncheon concluded in a frantic, suffocating blur. I stayed hidden in the shadows, seamlessly blending in with the hired catering staff as they cleared the tables. I watched Camille practically sprint out of the ballroom, her manicured fingers digging viciously into Desmond's expensive suit jacket. She hissed at him to find Preston immediately. I quietly abandoned my post, slipping through the hidden service corridor that ran directly behind the main walls of the estate. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster directly behind Desmond's private, soundproofed study, listening to the magnificent collapse of their perfect world. Inside the study, Camille was hyperventilating. She paced the length of the rare Persian rug, her voice a shrill, terrified shriek. She confessed everything in a rapid, panic-stricken flood. She told Desmond that the charity accounts could not possibly survive a professional audit. The official ledgers were a complete fabricated fiction. For the past 5 years, she had been aggressively skimming off the top of the foundation's tax-exempt donations. She confessed to using the stolen charity funds to finance her seasonal shopping sprees in Paris, her private month-long spa retreats in Switzerland, and a massive undocumented gambling debt she had accrued in Monaco. The charity was short by hundreds of thousands of dollars. She wept, screaming that if those independent auditors looked at the actual bank statements, she would be exposed to her entire social circle as a common thief and immediately arrested for grand larceny. Desmond roared in furious disbelief. I heard the sound of heavy glass shattering. as he violently swept a crystal decanter off his mahogany desk. He viciously berated his wife for her staggering stupidity, but his primary concern was the family reputation. A public arrest for charity fraud would instantly destroy Sterling Enterprises. Desmond spun around to face Preston, who was standing quietly near the door. Desmond barked a desperate, frantic order. He commanded his son-in-law to execute a ghost transfer immediately. He told Preston to pull $800,000 directly from the primary corporate operational reserves and dump it into Camille's charity account to plug the massive glaring hole before the auditors crossed the threshold. Preston nodded with his usual insufferable arrogance. He adjusted his silk tie, assuring Desmond that it was a simple routine adjustment. He pulled his secure mobile banking tablet from his briefcase, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced ease. He promised Desmond the money would be safely rerouted in less than 60 seconds. I pressed my hands against the wall in the dark hallway, my heart hammering with dark, glorious anticipation. I knew exactly what Preston was about to see. Through the heavy oak door, I heard a sudden sharp intake of breath. Preston tapped the glass screen violently. He tapped it again much harder. A panicked, breathless muttering began to spill from his lips. Desmond snapped at him, demanding to know what was taking so long, his voice vibrating with impatience. Preston's voice shook as he finally answered. He told Desmond that the corporate operational portal was completely locked down. He stared at the screen in total disbelief, his voice rising in panic as he announced that the primary reserve accounts were showing a balance of absolute zero. The funds were entirely gone, and their administrative access was completely revoked. Desmond exploded, ordering Preston to stop playing stupid games and call their private banking executive immediately. I heard the distinct sound of a phone being placed on speaker. The dial tone rang out loud and clear in the tense, suffocating silence of the study. A senior banking official answered after the second ring. Preston demanded an immediate security override, shouting wildly about unauthorized freezes, technical glitches, and threatening to fire the entire banking staff. The banker's voice remained painfully, surgically calm, cutting through Preston's unhinged hysteria. The banker informed Preston that there was no technical error on their end. He stated with brutal clarity that the primary corporate debt holder, Apex Holdings, had just initiated a highly aggressive hostile takeover. The banker explained that a legally binding assignment of liability had been executed and verified just days prior, triggering a massive, irreversible breach of contract clause across all Sterling accounts. Because of that signed document, Apex Holdings had legally frozen every single credit line, completely liquidated the corporate operational reserves, and seized total control of the Sterling estate's entire financial portfolio. Preston's hand went completely slack. The expensive, secure smartphone slipped freely from his trembling fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing crack. The sharp, echoing crack of the expensive smartphone hitting the hardwood floor snapped the room out of its paralyzed silence. Desmond lunged forward, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his tailored suit, his face purple with absolute, unrestrained fury. He shook his son-in-law violently, demanding answers, demanding solutions, demanding that Preston somehow reverse the irreversible. But Preston just stood there, his usual arrogant smirk entirely wiped away, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man who realized he had just been outplayed by an invisible predator. There was no technical glitch to fix. There was no banking error to correct. The corporate operational portal was a barren wasteland. The following 48 hours descended into an absolute, unmitigated bloodbath for Sterling Enterprises. The financial squeeze initiated by Apex Holdings was not merely a temporary inconvenience, it was a total aggressive corporate asphyxiation. The supply lines were choked dry almost instantly. Subcontractors across all 5 of Desmond's major luxury development sites walked off the job in mass protests, leaving half-finished high-rises to rot in the relentless Atlanta sun. The corporate switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree with furious investors, panicked vendors, and aggressive creditors demanding immediate liquid payment. The massive Sterling empire, built on decades of ruthless acquisition and iron-fisted control, was hemorrhaging cash it no longer possessed. Every single credit card associated with the family was declined. Every secondary bank account was frozen, pending the hostile takeover review. Desmond was trapped in a financial vice, and the pressure was actively crushing the life out of his legacy. By Friday evening, the atmosphere inside the Sterling estate was toxic. The grand formal dining room, usually a theater for Camille's elaborate social orchestration, felt like a bunker bracing for a direct missile strike. Camille was conspicuously absent, having locked herself in the master suite. After the charity luncheon, humiliation terrified to face her social circle or her husband. Desmond sat at the head of the long mahogany table. His silk tie loosened his eyes heavily. Bloodshot, a half-empty glass of scotch trembling violently in his grip. Jada sat frozen to his right, staring blankly at her untouched dinner. The mounting strain of her husband's sudden suspicious absence and the terrifying rumors of corporate ruin had completely eroded her usual arrogant posture. She looked small, fragile, and deeply afraid. I entered the room silently, carrying a fresh pitcher of iced water, perfectly playing my designated role as the invisible servile shadow. Desmond's phone buzzed aggressively on the table for what felt like the 100th time that hour. He swiped it onto the floor with a feral, guttural snarl. He was a man accustomed to absolute dominion, and watching his entire universe evaporate in real time was driving him to the very brink of insanity. He looked up, his manic, bloodshot eyes locking directly onto me. All the suppressed rage, the profound humiliation of his failing business, the massive charity scandal hanging over his wife, and the sheer terror of his impending bankruptcy found a convenient, familiar target. He picked up his heavy porcelain dinner plate piled high with roasted vegetables and steak and hurled it directly at me with a sudden, explosive burst of violence. The heavy plate struck my shoulder, shattering into sharp pieces against the wall behind me. Hot food and rich sauce splattered across my uniform, soaking through the fabric and dripping onto the polished floor. "You are a jinx," Desmond roared, his voice echoing off the crystal chandelier, his face contorted with unhinged malice. He stood up, knocking his heavy chair backward to the floor. "Everything in my life was perfect until you showed up. Everything has gone entirely wrong since your birthday. You brought this curse into my house." I did not flinch. I did not cower. A few months ago, this display of raw aggression would have sent me shrinking into a corner, apologizing for a mistake I did not commit, begging for a forgiveness I did not owe. Now I felt absolutely nothing but clinical detached observation. I looked down at the mess on my shirt, the dark stains ruining the crisp fabric. I slowly reached for a pristine linen napkin from the serving cart. I calmly wiped the debris from my clothes, my movements incredibly steady and deliberate. I lifted my chin and met Desmond's furious, wild gaze with eyes completely devoid of fear. "A house built on stolen foundations will eventually collapse, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and absolutely lethal. The words hung in the suffocating air of the dining room. I watched his face closely, waiting for the realization to dawn, waiting for him to recognize the exact phrase my biological mother used to tell him before he destroyed her life and stole her legacy. I wanted to see the exact moment the color drained from his face as he realized his unwanted, discarded daughter was the architect of his total ruin. But Desmond was entirely too consumed by his own catastrophic panic to hear the warning. He missed the double meaning entirely. He dismissed my words as the nonsensical, insolent rambling of a bitter dependent. He turned his back on me, cursing under his breath as he poured himself another heavy measure of scotch, completely oblivious to the fact that his executioner was standing right in his dining room watching him bleed out. While Desmond drowned his absolute terror in expensive liquor, and Jada sat paralyzed by denial at the dining table, Preston was upstairs actively severing the very last of his ties. He was a creature of pure calculating survival, and he knew perfectly well that the Apex Holdings takeover was the final death knell for the Sterling family. The frozen accounts meant the gig was entirely up. He did not bother returning to the dining room to comfort his wife or assist his father-in-law. He retreated silently to the massive master suite he shared with Jada, locking the heavy double doors securely behind him. He moved with cold, practiced efficiency, a man who had been planning this exact exit strategy for months. He pulled a sleek, unmarked black duffel bag from a hidden biometric compartment at the very back of his walk-in closet. He unzipped it, revealing neat, tight stacks of $100 bills he had been quietly siphoning from the corporate accounts in untraceable increments. He added a small fireproof pouch containing 3 offshore passports each, featuring his face under a completely different, impeccably forged alias. He packed a burner phone loaded with the encrypted contact information for Chloe Vance, who was currently waiting for him in Geneva. Finally, he reached into the small steel safe mounted beneath his desk and withdrew a compact, fully loaded handgun. He checked the magazine, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud and final in the quiet, luxurious bedroom. He buried the weapon deep beneath the stacks of stolen cash and zipped the duffel bag shut. Preston slung the heavy strap over his shoulder, casting one last emotionless glance around the lavish room that Desmond Sterling's money had paid for. He was not going to wait around for the federal auditors to arrive. He was not going to wait for Desmond to discover the hollowed-out corporate shell, and he certainly was not going to drag his clueless wife down with him. He was abandoning Jada and Desmond to face the absolute crushing ruin of their empire alone, and he was walking out the door tonight. The heavy oak front door of the Sterling estate clicked shut behind Preston, sealing his escape. He strode briskly down the sweeping driveway toward his Aston Martin, the thick strap of the black duffel bag digging reassuringly into his shoulder. The crisp night air felt like absolute freedom. For 3 years he had played the role of the devoted, sycophantic son-in-law to a man he secretly despised, and a wife he found utterly suffocating. Now, with the Apex Holdings takeover tearing the Sterling empire to shreds, his meticulously planned exit strategy was finally in motion. He slid into the driver's seat, tossed the bag containing the passports, the gun, and the stolen cash onto the passenger side, and sped off toward Peachtree DeKalb Airport. His private charter was waiting on the tarmac, fully fueled and cleared for a direct flight to the Cayman Islands. He needed to physically secure the master keys to his offshore accounts before meeting Chloe in Geneva. He was hours away from vanishing completely. The private aviation terminal was wonderfully quiet at this hour, bathed in soft amber light and smelling faintly of expensive espresso and aviation fuel. Preston bypassed the main lounge, carrying himself with the effortless arrogance of a man who had successfully outsmarted everyone in his life. He approached the mahogany concierge desk, flashing his perfectly forged Canadian passport at the attendant. He offered a charming, practiced smile, requesting immediate boarding. The attendant nodded, typing his alias into the system. Preston turned toward the glass doors leading out to the runway, already imagining the warm Caribbean breeze. "Going somewhere, Preston? Without your lovely wife?" The voice was smooth, highly amused, and terrifyingly familiar. Preston froze, his blood running entirely cold. He slowly turned around. Nia stepped casually out of the VIP lounge. She was dressed in an immaculate dark tailored suit that screamed quiet wealth, holding a steaming latte in one hand. She took a slow sip, her eyes locked onto his radiating absolute predatory control. Preston's charming facade instantly shattered. His mind raced frantically, trying to calculate how the disgraced, illegitimate daughter of Desmond Sterling had tracked him to a private airfield at midnight. He let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. He told Nia she was completely out of her depth. He warned her to step aside and go back to the guest house before he had security arrest her for stalking. He turned his back on her, taking a firm step toward the sliding glass doors. 2 massive, broad-shouldered men in identical dark suits stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, entirely blocking the exit. They did not look like airport security. They moved with lethal, synchronized precision, courtesy of Elijah's elite personal detail. Preston's heart hammered violently against his ribs. His right hand twitched instinctively, reaching toward the zipper of his duffel bag, where his loaded handgun rested. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric, The larger of the two guards clamped a hand around Preston's wrist with bone-crushing force. The guard leaned in, twisting the arm just enough to send a blinding flash of pain shooting up to Preston's shoulder, silently daring him to try it. Preston gasped, his knees buckling slightly under the immense pressure. Nia walked forward, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She stopped inches from his face. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She casually handed her latte to the second guard and pulled a sleek silver tablet from her leather folio. She tapped the screen once, bringing up a highly encrypted financial dashboard, and shoved it directly into Preston's line of sight. Preston stared at the screen, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Displayed in high-definition clarity were the exact routing numbers for his hidden Cayman Islands shell companies, the accounts holding the tens of millions of dollars he had painstakingly siphoned from Sterling Enterprises over the past 3 years. As he watched, completely paralyzed by shock, the massive digital balance began to aggressively plummet. Millions vanished by the second, tumbling through an untraceable network of phantom servers. 10 million, 5 million, 1 million, 0. The accounts were completely irreversibly drained. "I hacked your shell companies," Nia stated, her tone conversational, as if commenting on the weather. "I ripped through your pathetic amateur firewalls 3 days ago. I know about Chloe Vance. I know about the Geneva tickets. And as of 60 seconds ago, every single cent you stole from my father's fraudulent firm has been permanently seized. You have absolutely nothing." Preston stared at the blinking 0 on the screen. The air rushed out of his lungs. The reality of his situation crashed over him with the weight of a collapsing building. He was stranded. He was broke. He was standing in an airport with a bag full of illegal firearms and forged travel documents. Panic seized his throat. He began to beg. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy instantly dissolved into a pathetic, desperate coward. He pleaded with Nia, offering to testify against Desmond. He promised to give her all the internal corporate ledgers, the passwords, the hidden safety deposit boxes. He eagerly offered to throw Jada to the federal prosecutors if Nia would just give him a fraction of the money and let him walk onto the plane. Nia looked at him with profound, absolute disgust. She told him that she did not need his help to destroy Desmond because she had already done it. She did not want his testimony. She wanted his complete, unconditional submission. "You belong to me now," Nia whispered, stepping even closer. "If you try to run, if you try to warn Desmond, or if you even look at a plane ticket again, I will personally hand this tablet, your fake passports, and the gun in your bag directly to the FBI. You will spend the next 30 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, and fleeing prosecution." Preston swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He was entirely trapped, backed into a corner by a woman he and his wife had spent weeks viciously humiliating. Nia issued her final, unbreakable commands. She ordered Preston to pick up his duffel bag. She told him to get back into his car and drive straight back to the Sterling estate. He was going to walk through the front door, climb into bed next to Jada, and act as though absolutely nothing was wrong. He was going to smile at the breakfast table. He was going to wear his expensive suits and play the role of the devoted, supportive husband while the corporate ship sank straight to the bottom of the ocean. He would watch the federal agents raid the house. He would watch Desmond lose his mind, and he would stay right there in the fire with them, burning alive in the chaos. "You wanted to be part of this family so badly, Preston," Nia said, a chilling, triumphant smile curving her lips. "Now you are going to stay for the bitter end. Turn around and walk back to your car." Preston's jaw trembled. He looked at the massive security guards, then at the glowing empty bank accounts on the tablet screen. Completely broken and utterly terrified, he slowly picked up his heavy bag. He turned his back on the private jet, waiting on the tarmac, walking out of the terminal like a dead man marching to the gallows. He was returning to the mansion, trapped in a cage of his own, making fully aware that the woman holding the keys was going to enjoy watching him suffocate. The sheer audacity of the Sterling family was a marvel to witness. Less than 72 hours after Preston had crawled back into the mansion, a broken and tethered captive to my blackmail, Desmond and Camille proceeded with their spectacular 40th anniversary gala. They had rented out the entire grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, transforming the cavernous space into a nauseating display of manufactured opulence. Cascading walls of imported white roses framed the room, while a 12-piece string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in pristine white jackets circled the floor carrying silver platters of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. To the untrained eye, it was the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. To me, it was a beautifully decorated sinking ship. Desmond had spared no expense using the absolute last drops of his hidden personal credit lines to fund the extravaganza. It was not a celebration of love. It was a desperate, transparent theatrical production designed to project an illusion of absolute financial invulnerability. He was aggressively working the room, cornering wealthy venture capitalists and foreign real estate tycoons, practically begging them to invest in his new fabricated commercial developments. He slapped backs, poured expensive scotch, and laughed a little too loudly, completely unaware that every single potential investor in the room had already received an anonymous, highly encrypted email detailing the catastrophic failure of his supply lines and the absolute freeze on his accounts. While Desmond played the desperate salesman, his daughter paraded through the ballroom like an oblivious queen. Jada wore a custom floor-length silk gown that clung to her frame, dripping in diamonds she did not know were about to be repossessed. She clung tightly to Preston's arm, flashing her brilliant hollow smile at the photographers circling the event. She boasted loudly to a group of socialites about her upcoming romantic getaway to Geneva, completely unaware that the tickets had been canceled, the offshore accounts drained, and the mistress discarded. Preston, however, looked as though he was walking to his own execution. His bespoke tuxedo hung on him like a shroud. He was sweating profusely, beads of moisture glistening on his forehead under the harsh chandelier lights. His eyes darted erratically around the ballroom, filled with a primal, consuming terror. Every time he tried to take a sip of his bourbon, his hand shook violently, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal glass. He was a man trapped in a waking nightmare. And every single time his panicked gaze swept the room, I made sure I was right there watching him. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, swirling a glass of sparkling water, catching his eye across the crowded floor. I did not sneer. I did not glare. I simply offered him a slow, knowing smile and slightly tilted my glass in his direction. Preston physically flinched. He choked on his drink, coughing violently as Jada patted his back with mild, performative concern. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, pulling her trembling husband in the opposite direction, utterly convinced that I was the one desperate for his attention. She was so blinded by her own narcissism, she could not see that the man holding her hand was entirely owned by the woman she despised. Camille, of course, could never simply let a social gathering pass without attempting to assert her absolute dominance. She spotted me standing near the edge of the dance floor, wearing a simple, elegant dark gown that Elijah had expressly sent over for the occasion. Camille's face tightened with sheer resentment. She could not stand the fact that I was breathing the same air as her affluent peers. She marched toward a passing waiter, snatched a heavy silver tray, loaded with freshly poured champagne flutes from his hands, and walked directly up to me. Her eyes burned with that familiar toxic malice. She shoved the heavy silver tray forcefully against my chest, forcing me to grip the edges to prevent the crystal glasses from shattering onto the marble floor. Her voice was a low, venomous hiss masked perfectly by a wide, photogenic smile for the benefit of the watching crowd. She told me that I was not a guest in her kingdom. She reminded me that I was a charity case, an unwanted stain on her perfect family portrait, and she ordered me to make myself useful. She commanded me to walk the perimeter of the room and serve drinks to the actual executives, specifically instructing me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I looked down at the tray of champagne. I looked back up into Camille's arrogant, heavily powdered face. I did not argue. I did not throw the drinks at her feet. I simply smiled a cold, empty expression that made a brief flicker of uncertainty cross her eyes. I told her I would be absolutely delighted to serve the guests. I promised her it would be a night no one in Atlanta would ever forget. I turned my back on her and gripped the silver tray, but I did not walk toward the thirsty socialites. The lights in the grand ballroom began to dim, signaling the start of the evening's main presentation. A heavy hush fell over the crowd as the spotlight shifted to the massive, high-definition screens flanking the main stage. The soft, swelling chords of a romantic orchestral piece began to play over the state-of-the-art sound system. A beautifully edited slideshow commenced displaying decades of carefully curated photographs. Desmond and Camille at their wedding. Desmond cutting the ribbon at his first corporate high-rise. Camille wearing my biological mother's stolen emeralds at a charity gala. It was a perfectly sanitized, completely fraudulent history of a violently corrupt empire. Desmond stepped up to the mahogany podium in the center of the stage, tapping the microphone, preparing to deliver his keynote address to the wealthy investors he desperately needed to con. I walked right past the front row of VIP tables. I ignored the confused whispers of the security guards. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the elevated audio-visual booth positioned at the very back of the ballroom. Standing in the shadows of the tech booth was a tall man in a dark uniform. He was not a hotel employee. He was Elijah's top cyber operative seamlessly embedded into the event staff. I walked smoothly up the carpeted steps toward the side of the main stage, the silver tray balanced perfectly in my hands. I turned slightly, locking eyes with the operative across the vast sea of faces. I gave him a single definitive nod. The operative hit the master override switch. The swelling romantic music instantly warped into a horrific screeching feedback loop that forced the guests in the front row to clap their hands over their ears. The massive screens displaying the Sterling family's fabricated glorious history flickered violently, and then with a sharp, heavy mechanical clank that echoed through the entire ballroom, the screens cut to absolute pitch black. The microphone on Desmond's podium went completely dead. The grand illusion was over. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly gripped the magnificent ballroom. The sudden plunge into pitch blackness caught the hundreds of elite guests completely off guard. Down on the floor, waitstaff froze mid-step, silver trays hovering in the dark. Desmond stood at the mahogany podium, his mouth hanging open violently, tapping the dead microphone in a frantic, desperate rhythm. He forced a tight, artificial chuckle, looking blindly toward the back of the room, assuming a simple blown fuse was interrupting his grand moment. Then the massive high-definition screens flared back to life. The light they cast was no longer the warm, romantic glow of carefully curated family photographs. It was the stark, blinding, unforgiving white of scanned legal documents. The images loomed 20 feet high, illuminating the horrified faces of the wealthy attendees. It was a masterclass in total, inescapable exposure. The first slide was a series of highly confidential offshore bank statements, heavily highlighted in glowing neon yellow. The documents tracked a massive illegal hemorrhage of corporate funds, mapping out exactly how Sterling Enterprises had been systematically gutted from the inside out. Before the crowd could even begin to process the financial ruin displayed before them, the screens aggressively flashed to a new set of files. These were older, the paper appearing yellowed and creased on the digital display, but the black ink was devastatingly clear. They were forged adoption and legal guardianship papers. Next to them appeared the undeniable proof of a stolen $15 million trust fund. A collective visceral gasp ripped through the grand ballroom. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The venture capitalists and real estate tycoons Desmond had been shamelessly courting just minutes prior physically recoiled from their tables, their faces twisting in absolute unvarnished disgust. The documents displayed on the towering screens proved without a shadow of a doubt that Desmond Sterling had deliberately and maliciously forged legal documents immediately following my biological mother's death. He had legally erased my maternal rights solely to seize unfettered control of the $15 million inheritance she had established exclusively for me. He had used my stolen money to build the very empire that was now collapsing around him. Desmond completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. The meticulously crafted mask of the untouchable billionaire shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He lunged away from the podium, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and animalistic rage. He practically vaulted over the lavish floral arrangements bordering the stage, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He clawed at the dead microphone, realizing it was entirely useless, and turned his fury directly toward the audiovisual booth and then violently toward me. "Turn that off!" Desmond screamed, his voice cracking, raw and desperate, echoing without any amplification across the vast, echoing room. He pointed a trembling, manic finger at the screen, spit flying from his lips. "It is a lie. It is a complete fabrication. She is a psychotic, jealous brat. She is trying to ruin us because she is nothing. Turn it off." He looked like a madman, his expensive tuxedo suddenly appearing like a costume on a crumbling imposter. The elite crowd stared at him in horrified fascination, watching the mighty Desmond Sterling unravel in real time. I calmly stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wings, walking directly into the harsh, glaring spotlight. A secondary microphone entirely isolated from Desmond's dead podium and securely activated by my operative in the booth rested perfectly in my hand. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of emotion or anger bleed into my voice. The cold, surgical precision of my tone cut through Desmond's hysterical screaming, instantly silencing the chaotic room. "My name is Nia," I announced, the pristine acoustics of the ballroom carrying my steady voice to every single corner. "I am a corporate restructuring executive. I was formally contracted by Montgomery Holdings to conduct an independent comprehensive audit of Sterling Enterprises ahead of their recent corporate acquisition." I let the name drop like a live grenade. A shockwave of realization washed over the investors in the front rows. They knew exactly what Montgomery Holdings was, and they knew exactly what an independent audit of this magnitude meant, and what I found hidden beneath decades of aggressive public relations and fabricated success. I continued, my gaze sweeping over the silent, captivated audience, is a $50 million operational deficit built entirely on fraud, massive embezzlement, and direct theft. I turned slowly to look directly at Desmond, who was frozen in horror on the stage steps, his chest heaving as he stared up at me. "You built an empire on the stolen foundations of a $15 million trust fund that belonged to me. You forged legal documents, you silenced those who questioned your authority, and you bled your own company dry to fund a lavish lifestyle you could never actually afford." Down on the main floor, the reality of the situation was violently tearing the Sterling family apart. Jada was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her hair, pulling at the elaborate styling. Her diamond-drenched wrists shook uncontrollably as the opulent illusion of her entire life burned to the ground in front of her social circle. She turned wildly to her husband, who was standing completely paralyzed next to her. Preston's face was slick with a terrified, guilty sweat. He stared at the screens, knowing his own financial crimes were only a single slide away from being broadcast to the room. Jada grabbed the lapels of Preston's tuxedo, shaking him frantically. Her voice was a shrill, hysterical shriek that sliced through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "Preston! Do something, call the police, sue them, fix this right now." Preston stared at his frantic wife. He looked up at me on the stage, the memory of the glowing tablet, his empty offshore accounts, and the absolute promise of federal prison flashing behind his eyes. He knew he was entirely trapped. The intense, crushing pressure of the moment finally fractured him completely. His survival instinct violently overrode his marital vows. He brutally shoved Jada's hands off his chest, pushing her away with a force that made her stumble backward into a cocktail table. "Shut up!" Preston yelled, his voice cracking with a potent mixture of profound terror and years of deeply suppressed resentment. He backed away from her, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at Desmond on the stage, and then turning it directly toward his horrified wife. "Your father is a colossal, pathetic fraud, and you are nothing but a delusional, useless gold digger. I am done cleaning up your family's toxic messes. I am cooperating fully with the feds." Preston's words hung in the air, toxic and incredibly final. He did not give Jada a second glance. He turned on his heel, shoved his way through the stunned crowd of elites, and bolted toward the service exit with the desperate, frantic speed of a rat fleeing a burning building. Jada was left standing completely alone in the center of the grand ballroom, her hands suspended in midair, the heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists catching the harsh, unforgiving glare of the damning projection screens above. The realization hit her with the physical force of a freight train. The limitless black cards, the seasonal designer wardrobes, the European vacations, the entire foundation of her arrogant identity was entirely gone. She was not a billionaire heiress. She was the penniless daughter of a thief publicly discarded by a coward who had just admitted to aiding federal prosecutors. The paralyzing shock gripping Jada mutated instantly into a violent, unhinged rage. She spun around, her eyes wild and feral, frantically searching the room for a target. She found Camille standing near the shattered remains of a VIP table, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic collapse of her social empire. Jada let out a raw, guttural scream and lunged directly at her own mother. She grabbed Camille by the delicate lace shoulders of her custom gown, shaking her with a frantic, animalistic strength. The meticulously crafted, flawless facade of the Sterling women disintegrated into a public, humiliating brawl right there on the ballroom floor. Jada shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysteria, blaming Camille for the entire disaster. She screamed that Camille had aggressively orchestrated the marriage, practically forcing her down the aisle, because Preston supposedly possessed old money elite connections and the perfect pedigree to elevate their status in society. You told me he had money. You ruined my life. You made me marry a spineless coward, just so you could show off to your country club friends, and now I have absolutely nothing. Jada shoved her mother violently backward. Camille stumbled, her designer heels catching on the thick edge of a heavy Persian rug. She crashed backward into a towering display of champagne flutes. Crystal shattered across the polished marble floor with a deafening crash, splashing expensive vintage wine over Camille's gown and leaving her sitting in a sprawling puddle of broken glass and ruined pride. Camille gasped for air, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled, disheveled mess, her heavily powdered face streaked with running black mascara. She looked up, expecting anyone to rush forward and offer her a hand. She expected the wealthy socialites she had spent decades entertaining and manipulating to flock to her aid. Instead, she met a solid, impenetrable wall of cold, judgmental stares. The elite crowd of Atlanta was actively turning their backs on her. Women who had air-kissed her cheeks just an hour ago were now whispering behind their hands, looking at Camille as if she carried a highly contagious disease. The venture capitalists and real estate tycoons were quietly stepping away furiously, typing on their phones, calling their legal teams, frantically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling name. The social isolation was absolute and instantaneous. Desperate, utterly delusional, and completely disconnected from the reality of her own crimes, Camille turned her tear-streaked face toward the main stage. She looked up at me, standing calm and untouched in the harsh spotlight. In a staggering, nauseating display of narcissistic manipulation, she attempted to weaponize guilt. She dragged herself up from the floor, ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath her shoes, and took a trembling step toward the stage. She extended a shaking hand, her voice vibrating with manufactured, pathetic betrayal. "How could you do this to us? After all we did for you, we took you in. We fed you. We put clothes on your back when you had absolutely nothing. We gave you a family when nobody else wanted you." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no anger, no pity, and no remorse. I opened my mouth to tell her exactly what I thought of her twisted definition of family, but I did not have to waste a single breath. Before I could speak, the heavy brass-studded double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The heavy impact cut through Camille's weeping and silenced the whispering crowd instantly. A deep, booming, authoritative voice echoed across the vast, cavernous space, freezing every single person in their tracks. "You did not take her in. You stole her to rob her blind." The crowd parted instinctively, moving aside as if repelled by a magnetic force. Walking straight down the center aisle, exuding an aura of absolute uncompromising power, was Elijah Montgomery. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his expression hardened into a mask of lethal, calculating fury. And he was not walking alone. He was flanked on all sides by federal agents, wearing dark tactical jackets, their golden badges gleaming under the chandelier lights, their hands resting comfortably near their holstered weapons. A suffocating silence gripped the grand ballroom. The sudden plunge into pitch blackness caught the hundreds of elite guests completely off guard. Down on the polished marble floor, waitstaff froze mid-step, heavy silver trays hovering in the dark. At the center of the stage, Desmond stood at the mahogany podium, his mouth hanging open. He tapped the dead microphone in a frantic rhythm, forcing a tight artificial chuckle, while looking blindly toward the back of the room, assuming a simple blown fuse was interrupting his crowning moment. Then the massive high-definition screens flared back to life. The light they cast was no longer the warm, romantic glow of carefully curated family photographs. It was the stark, blinding, unforgiving white of scanned legal documents. The images loomed 20 feet high, illuminating the horrified faces of the wealthy attendees. It was a masterclass in total, inescapable exposure. The first slide displayed a series of highly confidential offshore bank statements, heavily highlighted in glowing neon yellow. The documents tracked a massive illegal hemorrhage of corporate funds, mapping out exactly how Sterling Enterprises had been systematically gutted from the inside out to maintain their fraudulent lifestyle. Before the crowd could even begin to process the financial ruin displayed before them, the screens aggressively flashed to a new set of files. These were older, the paper appearing yellowed and creased on the digital display, but the black ink was devastatingly clear. They were forged adoption and legal guardianship papers. Right next to them appeared the undeniable proof of a stolen $15 million trust fund. A collective visceral gasp ripped through the grand ballroom. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The venture capitalists and real estate tycoons Desmond had been shamelessly courting just minutes prior physically recoiled from their tables, their faces twisted in absolute, unvarnished disgust. The documents displayed on the towering screens proved without a shadow of a doubt that Desmond Sterling had deliberately and maliciously forged legal documents immediately following my biological mother's death. He had legally erased my maternal rights solely to seize unfettered control of the inheritance she had established exclusively for me. Desmond completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. The meticulously crafted mask of the untouchable billionaire shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He lunged away from the podium, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and animalistic rage. He practically vaulted over the lavish floral arrangements bordering the stage, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He clawed at the dead microphone, realizing it was entirely useless, and turned his fury directly toward the audio-visual booth. "Turn that off!" Desmond screamed, his voice cracking, raw and desperate. He pointed a trembling, manic finger at the screen, spit flying from his lips. "It is a lie. It is a complete fabrication. She is a psychotic, jealous brat. She is trying to ruin us because she is nothing. Turn it off." He looked like a madman, his expensive tuxedo suddenly appearing like a costume on a crumbling imposter. The elite crowd stared at him in horrified fascination, watching the mighty Desmond Sterling unravel in real time. He looked wildly around for his private security detail, but Elijah's operatives had already quietly neutralized the hotel staff. Desmond was entirely alone on the stage of his own destruction. I calmly stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wings, walking directly into the harsh, glaring spotlight. A secondary microphone entirely isolated from Desmond's dead podium and securely activated by my operative in the booth rested perfectly in my hand. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of emotion or anger bleed into my voice. The cold, surgical precision of my tone cut through Desmond's hysterical screaming, instantly silencing the chaotic room. "My name is Nia," I announced, the pristine acoustics of the ballroom carrying my steady voice to every single corner. "I am a corporate restructuring executive. I was formally contracted by Montgomery Holdings to conduct an independent comprehensive audit of Sterling Enterprises ahead of their recent corporate acquisition. I let the name drop like a live grenade. A shockwave of realization washed over the investors in the front rows. They knew exactly what Montgomery Holdings was, and they knew exactly what an independent audit of this magnitude meant. They were looking at a hostile takeover engineered from the inside. And what I found hidden beneath decades of aggressive public relations and fabricated success. I continued my gaze sweeping over the silent, captivated audience, is a $50 million operational deficit built entirely on fraud, massive embezzlement, and direct theft. I turned slowly to look directly at Desmond, who was frozen in horror on the stage steps, his chest heaving as he stared up at me. You built an empire on the stolen foundations of a trust fund that belonged to me. You forged legal documents, you silenced those who questioned your authority, and you bled your own company dry to fund a lavish lifestyle you could never actually afford. Down on the main floor, the reality of the situation was violently tearing the Sterling family apart. Jada was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her hair, pulling at the elaborate styling. Her diamond-drenched wrists shook uncontrollably as the opulent illusion of her entire life burned to the ground in front of her social circle. She turned wildly to her husband, who was standing completely paralyzed next to her. Preston's face was slick with a terrified, guilty sweat. He stared at the screens, knowing his own financial crimes were only a single investigation away from being broadcast to the room. Jada grabbed the lapels of Preston's tuxedo, shaking him frantically. Her voice was a shrill, hysterical shriek that sliced through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "Preston, do something! Call the police! Call your firm! Sue them! Fix this right now!" Preston stared at his frantic wife. He looked up at me on the stage, the memory of the glowing tablet, his empty offshore accounts, and the absolute promise of federal prison flashing behind his eyes. He knew he was entirely trapped. The intense, crushing pressure of the moment finally fractured him completely. His survival instinct violently overrode his marital vows and his desire to maintain his social standing. He brutally shoved Jada's hands off his chest, pushing her away with a force that made her stumble backward into a cocktail table. "Shut up!" Preston yelled, his voice cracking with a potent mixture of profound terror and years of deeply suppressed resentment. He backed away from her, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at Desmond on the stage, and then turning it directly toward his horrified wife. "Your father is a colossal, pathetic fraud, and you are nothing but a delusional, useless gold digger. I am done cleaning up your family's toxic messes. I am cooperating fully with the feds." The heavy silence in the ballroom stretched to its absolute breaking point as my words echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Desmond stood frozen, his hand still clutching the crumpled liability document he believed was his ultimate trump card. The manic, triumphant grin that had warped his face just seconds ago began to falter, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I stepped off the edge of the stage, the click of my heels sharp and rhythmic against the marble floor, completely unbothered by the federal agents fanning out across the room. I walked directly up to Desmond. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I did not sign a guarantor waiver that night in your study." I stated, my tone clinically detached. "You were so frantic to shift the blame, so desperate to cover up the massive financial craters in your logistics division, that you shoved a stack of papers across your desk and demanded my signature without a second thought. You assumed my compliance. You assumed my ignorance. You assumed that the girl you spent 2 decades treating like an uneducated charity case would not recognize the basic structure of a corporate transfer." Desmond's breathing grew ragged. His eyes darted from my face to the paper in his trembling hand. I swapped the core addendum. "Desmond." I continued, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. "What you are holding is not a liability waiver. It is an ironclad, irrevocable deed of forfeiture. By presenting this document to the federal authorities right here in front of a room full of witnesses, you did not implicate me. You just legally, voluntarily, and publicly acknowledged that your entire estate, your corporate holdings, and every single asset tied to the Sterling name are now officially the property of Montgomery Holdings to cover your debts." Desmond's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. He lifted the document, bringing it close to his face, his eyes desperately scanning the dense paragraphs of legal fine print he had completely ignored weeks ago. I watched as his gaze hit the specific clauses, detailing the total surrender of his equity to cover the $50 million deficit he had created. I watched him read the stipulations that transferred his liquid assets, his properties, and the very St. Regis Grand Ballroom we were standing in directly into Elijah's corporate portfolio. "Read the bottom line, Desmond," I instructed softly. "It explicitly states that this forfeiture is triggered immediately upon your presentation of this document to any legal or federal entity as a defense. You just activated your own absolute ruin." Desmond's knees buckled. The document slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. He staggered backward, his hands grasping uselessly at the air, as if trying to catch the billions of dollars that had just evaporated from his accounts. A strangled, pathetic wheeze escaped his throat. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and in a matter of seconds, he had been reduced to absolutely nothing. The lead federal agent stepped forward, moving with swift, practiced efficiency. He reached out, grabbing Desmond by the shoulder and spinning him around roughly. The sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. "Desmond Sterling," the agent's voice boomed deep and devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crowd of Atlanta elites erupted into a frenzy of shocked murmurs and scandalized gasps. The venture capitalists and real estate tycoons who had been shaking Desmond's hand mere minutes ago were now actively backing away, treating him like a complete pariah. Photographers who had been hired to document a glorious anniversary celebration were now rapidly snapping pictures of the mighty billionaire being perp-walked across his own dance floor in steel cuffs. Jada watched her father being hauled away, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. But the horror quickly morphed into something entirely different. A twisted, malicious smile stretched across her tear-streaked face. In her deeply fractured mind, she still believed that if her father went down, I would somehow be dragged down with him. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a desperate, spiteful hope, eagerly waiting for the federal agents to turn their attention in my direction. She wanted to see me in handcuffs. She needed to see me fall to validate her own existence. The federal agents completely ignored me. They moved past me with respectful nods, securing the perimeter and directing their focus entirely on the Sterling family. Jada's vindictive smile collapsed, replaced by a hollow, profound despair as the absolute finality of my victory settled over her. She was a deposed princess in a ruined kingdom, and she finally understood that nobody was coming to save her. While the ballroom dissolved into absolute chaos, while Camille wailed on the floor, and Desmond was dragged out the main doors by the FBI, another rat was desperately trying to abandon ship. Preston had used the distraction of Desmond's arrest to edge his way toward the shadowy perimeter of the room. He was sweating profusely, his custom tuxedo clinging to his trembling frame. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the socialites, abandoning his hysterical wife without a single backward glance. He reached the heavy velvet drapes masking the service corridor, slipping behind them, entirely convinced he had successfully evaded the federal sweep. He pushed through the service doors, stepping into the dim, narrow hallway leading to the loading dock. He let out a shaky, pathetic breath of relief, reaching into his pocket for his phone to arrange a quiet, untraceable flight out of the country. He did not even make it 3 steps. A massive, imposing figure stepped out of the shadows, entirely blocking the exit. It was Elijah's head of security, a man built like a concrete wall, standing with his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him stood 3 more highly trained operatives, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. Preston skidded to a halt, his dress shoes squeaking loudly against the linoleum floor. He spun around, frantic, looking for another way out, only to find the hallway behind him instantly filled with tactical jackets and gleaming badges. 2 FBI agents stepped forward, their expressions stony and resolute. They were holding thick, heavily sealed dossiers containing every single encrypted email, every offshore transfer receipt, and every piece of damning corporate sabotage I had meticulously handed over to Montgomery Holdings. Preston Vance, the agent stated, drawing his handcuffs. You are not going anywhere. We have a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence detailing your direct involvement in corporate fraud and international money laundering. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His shoulders slumped, his entire body trembling violently as the agents pushed him against the cinderblock wall and forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold steel locked around his wrists, sealing his fate. The grand illusion of the Sterling Empire had not just been shattered, it had been surgically permanently dismantled. Exactly 14 days later, the air inside the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was thick with a heavy, suffocating tension. The gallery was packed entirely to capacity. The very same venture capitalist real estate tycoons and high society socialites who had eagerly attended the St. Regis Gala were now crammed into the wooden pews, hungry to witness the final absolute destruction of the Sterling family. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked quietly by Elijah and my legal team. I wore a simple tailored charcoal suit. I did not need diamonds or designer labels to project power. I had the truth, and the truth had already won. At the defense table, the reality of their catastrophic fall was on full, humiliating display. Desmond Sterling and Preston Vance sat side by side, stripped of their bespoke tuxedos and platinum watches. They wore bright, oversized orange Department of Corrections jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the wooden table every time they shifted. Desmond looked like a hollow, entirely broken shell of a man. His skin was ashen, his face unshaven, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if still searching for a loophole, a bribe, or a back door that did not exist. Preston simply stared at his own chained hands, his shoulders violently shaking as he wept silently into his palms. Seated directly behind them in the first row of the gallery were Camille and Jada. They had narrowly avoided wearing the same orange jumpsuits solely due to a lack of direct operational signatures on the fraudulent corporate transfers. They had avoided federal prison, but they had not avoided ruin. They wore plain, unbranded clothing, their faces completely drained of their usual haughty arrogance. Jada aggressively chewed her thumbnail, looking at her chained husband with absolute, undisguised disgust. Camille sat rigid, clutching a cheap leather purse, her eyes fixed on the front of the room, still clinging to a desperate, delusional hope that her personal wealth would somehow remain untouched. The heavy oak door beside the bench swung open, and the bailiff called the courtroom to order. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Vance, an imposing, highly respected African-American woman with a reputation for absolute zero tolerance regarding corporate corruption, took her seat. She adjusted her glasses, peering down from the elevated bench. Her gaze swept over the defense table, and the sheer weight of her authority instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. Judge Vance did not mince her words. She opened the sentencing file, her voice resonating through the pristine acoustics of the courtroom with a cold, righteous fury. Desmond Sterling, the judge began, her tone cutting through the dead silence like a scalpel. In my 25 years on this bench, I have presided over countless cases of corporate malfeasance, but the sheer magnitude of your moral bankruptcy is staggering. You did not merely commit wire fraud or embezzle corporate funds. You used a grieving child's tragedy to line your own pockets. You exploited the death of a mother, forged legal guardianship documents, and stole the inheritance of an orphaned girl to fund a fraudulent empire. Desmond flinched, shrinking down into his plastic chair as the judge's words battered him. You and your accomplices parade as pillars of the community. Judge Vance continued, her voice rising in intensity, echoing across the packed gallery. You attended charity galas, you cut ribbons on hospital wings, and you accepted the applause of this city while quietly operating a syndicate of greed and theft. You are a predator dressed in a tailored suit, and today your predatory reign permanently ends. The judge picked up her gavel, her eyes locking directly onto Desmond. On the charges of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement, I sentence you, Desmond Sterling, to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Desmond let out a choked, guttural gasp. His heavy chains rattled violently as he collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. A sharp collective breath swept through the gallery. 20 years for a man his age was a definitive life sentence. He would die behind bars. Judge Vance turned her piercing gaze to Preston. Preston Vance, you were an officer of the court. You took an oath to uphold the law, and instead you utilized your legal expertise to facilitate, hide, and launder the proceeds of a massive criminal enterprise. Your cooperation with federal authorities in the final hour does not erase years of willing participation in this fraud. On the charges of money laundering and accessory to grand larceny, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. Preston let out a loud, pathetic sob, his head hitting the defense table. Jada did not even blink. She completely ignored her husband's breakdown, her eyes shifting nervously to the judge waiting for the civil asset forfeiture ruling. She believed her father's sentence was the end of it. She believed her personal accounts were safe. Judge Vance closed the criminal file and opened a significantly thicker blue folder. She looked directly past the defense table, locking eyes with Camille and Jada in the gallery. This court now turns to the matter of asset forfeiture and civil restitution, the judge announced, her voice flat and unyielding. It has been irrefutably proven by the prosecution and the independent auditors from Montgomery Holdings that the initial $15 million stolen from Nia Montgomery's trust fund was the sole seed money used to establish Sterling Enterprises. Camille stiffened her hands, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Under the legal doctrine of the fruits of the poisonous tree, Judge Vance stated, any and all assets generated, purchased, or maintained by those stolen funds are subject to immediate seizure. This court finds that Desmond Sterling acted entirely in bad faith. Therefore, the corporate veil protecting his personal and familial assets is completely pierced. Jada shot up from her seat, her voice shrill and panicked. Wait, what does that mean? I have an independent trust. My money is separate. Judge Vance struck her gavel sharply, the sharp crack silencing Jada instantly. Sit down, Ms. Sterling, or I will have you held in contempt of court. The judge waited for Jada to slowly lower herself back onto the wooden bench before delivering the final devastating blow. It means that every single penny attached to the Sterling name is completely frozen and forfeit. This includes corporate holdings, international real estate, offshore accounts, and all allegedly independent trust funds established for the Sterling children. It includes the vehicles you drive and the jewelry currently on your persons. Every single cent of the Sterling estate legally and rightfully belongs to Nia Montgomery. Camille let out a strangled cry. She looked down at the massive diamond ring on her hand and the pearl necklace around her throat. Federal marshals were already stepping into the aisles, moving directly toward the gallery. Camille and Jada realized with a crushing, absolute horror that they were not just walking out of the courthouse bankrupt. They were going to be stripped of their personal jewelry before they even reached the sidewalk. The complete systematic annihilation of the Sterling family was final. The crisp morning air carried the sharp scent of damp pine needles and the unmistakable, intoxicating aroma of absolute victory. I stood on the sweeping marble portico of the grandiose Buckhead estate. The towering Grecian columns, the meticulously manicured rose gardens, the sprawling circular driveway, it all belonged to me now. The federal judge had ruled with swift, merciless precision. The deeds had been forcibly transferred, the accounts seized, the locks changed. This was no longer the Sterling mansion. It was my home. Down on the cobblestone driveway, a team of private contractors moved with ruthless, unsympathetic efficiency. They were not utilizing the vintage leather travel trunks or the monogrammed designer luggage the Sterling women were accustomed to parading through private airports. The court order had been highly specific regarding the total seizure of all assets purchased with my stolen trust fund. Every single piece of haute couture, every luxury handbag, every imported pair of shoes, and every ounce of expensive jewelry remained locked securely inside the house, legally tagged and inventoried as my rightful property. Instead, the movers were hauling out Camille and Jada's personal non-luxury items in heavy-duty cheap black plastic trash bags. They tossed the bulging bags onto the damp grass without a shred of ceremony. The dull, heavy thud of plastic hitting the ground echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, a harsh soundtrack to their spectacular fall from grace. Jada stood near the edge of the driveway looking entirely unrecognizable. Without her sparkling diamond tennis bracelets, her seasonal silk gowns, and her army of personal stylists, she was just a small, terrified woman shivering in a basic gray sweatsuit. She was sobbing hysterically, her face blotchy and heavily swollen, watching the remnants of her identity being piled onto the lawn like common refuse. Her father was locked away in a federal holding cell awaiting permanent transfer. Her husband was preparing to serve 15 years in a high-security penitentiary. Her billionaire fantasy was dead and buried. She screamed at a mover who casually dropped a bag too close to her feet, but her voice cracked completely devoid of any real authority or power. The mover simply ignored her, turning his back and walking inside for another load. Camille was in an even worse state. The woman who had spent 2 decades ruling Atlanta high society with an iron fist terrorizing charity boards and country club committees now looked frail, aged, and utterly broken. Her neck was bare, stripped of the heavy pearls she used to clutch in moments of manufactured shock. Her fingers were devoid of the massive diamonds she used to flash at luncheons. She held a cheap generic canvas tote bag against her chest like a protective shield. She looked wildly down the pristine street, desperately expecting a black town car to arrive, expecting one of her wealthy socialite friends to swoop in and rescue her from this degrading nightmare. But her phone had permanently stopped ringing the very second the judge's gavel fell. The social isolation was absolute. She was financially and socially radioactive. The harsh reality of the driveway finally crushed whatever remaining delusion Camille harbored. She turned away from the towering pile of garbage bags and looked up at me standing calm and untouched on the elevated porch. Her face twisted into a mask of pathetic, unvarnished desperation. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out as she practically crawled up the wide marble steps. She collapsed physically at my feet, her hands resting on the cold stone. "Please!" Camille gasped, her voice ragged, raw, and soaked in frantic tears. She reached out her trembling fingers, hovering just inches from my shoes. "Please, Maya, Nia, we are your family. Where will we go? We have absolutely nothing." I looked down at her, feeling a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. There was no pity left to give. There was no anger left to burn. There was only the cold, sterile reality of consequence. This was the woman who had happily traded my mother's legacy for a stolen bank account. This was the woman who had forced me to sleep in a cramped attic, treating me like a stray dog, while she lived a life of stolen luxury. And now, at the very end of the line, she dared to invoke the word family. "You do not know the meaning of the word," I thought, watching her weep against the marble. "You traded family for a lie the day you forged those papers." I watched her sob for a moment longer, a highly specific memory flashing bright and clear in my mind. I remembered the night of the gala, the sheer arrogance of Preston Vance throwing a crisp bill at me, as if my dignity carried a cheap price tag. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against a crisp piece of paper I had specifically brought for this exact moment. I pulled out a brand new, pristine $100 bill. The green ink caught the bright morning sunlight. I held it out between my index and middle finger, letting it hover right in front of Camille's tear-streaked face. Her heavy sobbing hitched. Her eyes instantly locked onto the money, that deeply ingrained pathetic greed flaring up even in her absolute lowest moment. She instinctively reached a trembling, desperate hand toward the cash. I let go. The bill fluttered down, landing softly on the marble step. Before her fingers could even graze the paper, I brought the sharp heel of my stiletto down directly onto Benjamin Franklin's face. I ground my heel into the bill with deliberate force, pinning it firmly against the cold stone. Camille froze, staring blankly at my shoe, her hand hovering uselessly in the empty air. I looked slowly from Camille's devastated, tear-soaked face to Jada, who had stopped crying and was staring at us from the lawn in absolute paralyzing shock. I met their gazes one last time, ensuring they saw the total, uncompromising finality in my eyes. "Go buy yourselves a personality," I said, my voice dripping with cold, razor-sharp disdain. "Genetics play a part, you know." I did not wait for a response, nor did I care to hear one. I turned my back on the weeping women and the pathetic pile of black trash bags resting on the grass. I walked confidently across the threshold of my home, stepping into the grand foyer that had always rightfully been mine. I grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive oak double doors and pulled them shut. The heavy, resounding thud echoed with absolute finality, locking the Sterling women out in the cold and closing the chapter on my revenge forever. The heavy click of the lock echoed through the vast foyer, severing the sound of Camille's pathetic wailing and plunging the house into a profound, immaculate silence. I stood with my back against the oak door, taking a slow, deep breath. The air inside the mansion already felt different. The suffocating, toxic weight of the Sterling family's pretense had evaporated, leaving behind a space that was finally truly clean. I turned and walked across the marble floor, my footsteps ringing out with the steady rhythm of a woman who had just conquered her own ghosts. I bypassed the grand, ostentatious living rooms Camille had aggressively decorated and headed straight down the East Wing corridor. I stopped in front of a set of double mahogany doors, reaching out to push them open. The space inside took my breath away. For nearly 2 decades, Desmond had used this room as a glorified storage closet, burying it under boxes of discarded corporate marketing materials and broken furniture. Now it had been painstakingly, flawlessly restored. The rich, dark wood paneling gleamed. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, and the heavy oak desk sat perfectly centered in the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the bay windows. This was my biological mother's office. It was exactly as I remembered it from the fragmented, fading memories of my early childhood. The faint, comforting scent of lavender and old paper seemed to linger in the air, a ghost of the brilliant woman who had built the true foundation of this empire. I walked slowly around the room, brushing my fingertips against the polished wood of the desk, feeling an overwhelming, grounding sense of peace settle into my bones. The soft creak of the floorboards announced another presence. I turned to see Elijah standing in the doorway. The hardened, ruthless corporate raider who had orchestrated the hostile takeover was gone, replaced by an uncle looking at his niece with profound, unshielded pride. He stepped into the room holding a small, weathered velvet box in his hands. He walked up to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he looked around the restored office. He did not need to say how much the room meant to him. The quiet reverence in his posture communicated everything. He looked down at the velvet box, popping the delicate brass clasp. Resting on a bed of faded white satin was a stunning vintage emerald necklace, the deep green stones catching the sunlight and casting fractured prisms across the room. I recognized it instantly. It was the necklace my mother wore in the only photograph I had managed to salvage from my childhood, a piece Desmond had claimed was lost years ago. Elijah lifted the heavy stones from the box. He stepped behind me, gently draping the cool gold chain around my neck and securing the clasp. The weight of the emeralds against my collarbone was an anchor, a physical manifestation of my reclaimed heritage. I reached up my fingers, grazing the smooth facets of the jewels. Elijah placed his hands firmly on my shoulders, his reflection joining mine in the antique mirror hanging above the fireplace. We stood there in the quiet warmth of the room, 2 survivors who had systematically dismantled the monsters of our past. It was a moment of profound healing connection, untainted by lies, manipulation, or hidden agendas. I was finally truly home. The warm, golden sunlight of the office slowly shifts the reflection in the antique mirror, blurring and transitioning into the cool, sophisticated amber glow of the city at night. The cinematography returns to the sweeping, dynamic tracking shot in the penthouse. The camera glides effortlessly across the polished concrete floor, moving past the sleek modern furnishings and the towering floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a commanding panoramic view of the glittering skyline. The city below looks like a sprawling sea of diamonds, a massive empire pulsing with endless energy. I am standing by the glass, the vintage emerald necklace resting flawlessly against the plunging neckline of my dark silk dress. I hold a heavy crystal tumbler in my right hand, the amber liquid inside catching the ambient light of the room. The ice clinks softly against the glass, a sharp crystalline sound that cuts through the quiet jazz playing softly in the background. I raise the glass to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the aged bourbon. The burn is smooth, warm, and deeply satisfying. The camera slowly pushes in, moving from a wide, establishing shot into a tight, incredibly intimate close-up. The city lights reflect in my eyes as I lower the glass, my expression perfectly composed, radiating absolute, unshakable power. I look directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall with a calm, surgical precision. They thought they could bury me because I didn't fit their picture-perfect mold. But they didn't realize they were burying a seed. I didn't just survive their cruelty, I audited it. I liquidated their lies. And in the end, the most beautiful revenge isn't just taking everything they love, it's watching them realize they handed you the match to burn it all down. A slow, knowing smile spreads across my face, sharp and entirely victorious. The screen cuts to black.